Your sumo deadlift looks awful. Everybody knows it. They're all talking about it. And it's ugly, and you should stop.
Okay.
What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to the channel. If you're new, my name is Sean Noriega. I'm a competitive powerlifter and powerlifting coach. And today we are going to be talking about the 5 reasons your sumo deadlift sucks. We're gonna go over the problems and we're gonna give you the solutions. Now, if you're a competitive powerlifter, you've probably dabbled with sumo, or you currently do pull sumo and are struggling, or you're just a strength training enthusiast who has found, hey, I can't really afford to be pushing conventional deadlift because I run into pain, injury, or simply lack of recovery, and you wanna learn how to do this right. So, without further ado, let's talk about the 5 problems that most people have with sumo and how to fix them. So jumping right into it, the first reason that your sumo deadlift sucks, and this may come as a surprise to you, is that you're actually trying to open up the hips too much. Now, the conventional wisdom around sumo deadlifts for most of powerlifting's history has been that you need to try to create as much external rotation and abduction at the hips to have the best deadlift that you possibly can. But not only that, a lot of lifters have been convinced that the amount that they currently can open up is not enough. And this has put an undue pressure on a lot of lifters to subject themselves to what looks like medieval torture under the guise of stretching. Now, one of the problems sensationally that arises from this that many of you may have experienced is that people will deal with significant anterior hip discomfort. And the reason for this is that if I am driving a ton of external rotation through the hip, I am getting that femur pressing up against the front of the hip, and that can cause that hip flexor type discomfort that usually can arise at the start of the pull or at the end of the pull. And I'm here to tell you that you don't need to keep subjecting yourself to this, and that pain is not just symptomatic of, well, I don't have enough range of motion, so I clearly need to be doing more mobility. Fact of the matter is, you don't actually need to be opening up that much. And if you watch a lot of really high-level sumo deadlifters, you'll find that most of them don't actually try to abduct as much as possible. And in the cases where you do see this, there are usually 2 commonalities. The first is that they're using a deadlift bar, and the second, which might be in combination with the deadlift bar, is that they are using thicker plates. Now, the reason I mention this is that that combination specifically is incredibly forgiving of bad technical habits off the floor. Because once you actually break the floor, you are in more of this block pull starting position where it's much easier to use your legs independent of how efficient your starting position was. So what am I going to advise here? Well, in reality, your stance width and how wide you actually stand with your feet does depend on how much hip mobility you have available, as well as just what feels strong to some degree. However, what we then do with the femurs is very simple. All I'm going to advise to you guys is that when you get in your stance, you drive your knees in the direction the toes are pointing. So very simple, if my feet are at a 45-degree angle, I'm gonna get into my stance, get this athletic bend in the knee, and I'm going to drive my knee in the direction the toes are pointing. Because if you watch high-level sumo deadlifters, you'll notice that when they get to the wedge, when they're about to start their pull, where are their knees going? Their knees are tracking in the direction the toes are pointing. And when I talk about sumo deadlift, I'm all about setting angles early. That's a terminology you'll hear me use from time to time, is that if you set the angle early and then just move around it while you're maintaining that angle, you are going to have a much easier time deadlifting than if you're having to think about changing angles all throughout the pull. The second reason that your sumo deadlift sucks is that you are trying to get your hips too low and you're trying to get your torso too upright. And I understand this because anyone who's ever set up for a heavy pull knows the feeling of being afraid that if I'm too bent over when I start my pull, that I'm just gonna get folded and the bar is gonna staple me to the ground. Not a very fun proposition. So what's the defense mechanism people create? Well, they think to themselves, if I just get upright early, if I think about getting my head up, my chest up, I'm setting my grip, I'm dropping my hips while I'm doing it, then I'll be good. The problem is that this creates a false sensation of leverage, because what happens as soon as I start my pull? I go to push, my hips rise, they shoot back, my knees cave in, and the house that I thought I built on rock was really built on sand. And we have to remember why this happens, which is that even though the sumo deadlift is wider, even though the sumo deadlift is more quad than a conventional deadlift, the make or break technical foundation is a strong hinge. How you hinge an RDL down to the bar can make or break your pull. And what I would argue is that if you want to have a strong wedge and ultimately be as upright as you should be at the start of your pull, you actually need to be willing to let the chest fall and the hips go back. I know it sounds scary, but your initial approach after the step one athletic position that we talked about should be to actually let your torso tip and push your hips back. The reason for this is that when you have a good hinge, that's gonna set a good pelvic position. When you have a good hinge, it's gonna create backside tension. And when you have a good hinge, it creates space between you and the bar so that you actually have room to wedge. If you watch a lot of high-level sumo deadlifters, you'll notice that as they're setting up, they do have more of this bent over position, and then it looks like they magically pull themselves into this upright position, and you're thinking to yourself, man, there's some sorcery that they're doing in the interim, when in reality, it's the fact that they were bent over at the start that gave them the room to then wedge. The third reason your sumo deadlift sucks is easily the most common mistake I see, not just from sumo deadlifters, but from deadlifters in general, and sometimes can be the hardest to fix, which is that you are too stiff in your upper body. And this can come in one of two forms. Either that you're too stiff in the upper back and the arms, or you're too stiff in the lower back and the pelvis. And I'm first gonna start with the low back and the pelvis here, which is that everybody knows when they first start lifting, the 3 rings of death that you're told are gonna just end your powerlifting career are rounding your lower back while you're deadlifting. And whether you still subscribe to that or not, there are a lot of lifters who, to avoid this, will think about actually flexing the muscles of the lower back. So they'll contract the lower back to maintain some semblance of neutrality. Now, there are 2 problems with this. The first is that contracting your lower back is not actually a strong enough contraction to fight the flexion that the bar weight wants to pull you into. So you'll very quickly lose that and find it's not very efficient. But number 2 is that flexing your lower back muscles is just a band-aid for a bad hinge. If you hinge well, your pelvic orientation will be in the optimal position. And when I coach my lifters, I explicitly tell them you should not be thinking about contracting the muscles of your low back, mid back, upper back at any point during your setup. A good hinge will take care of that. But here's another problem that arises from thinking about flexing the low back, is that if you inevitably put yourself into too much extension, you're actually working against your ability to open up your hips. Because if we drive an anterior orientation at the level of the pelvis, that closes off how much space the femurs have to open up into external rotation. So maybe if you've dealt with that anterior hip discomfort, or simply find that you can't open up as much as you think you should be able to, the low back and pelvic extension is probably the place you should look to first. Because if you're just driving too much extension on the backside, you may just be fighting against yourself because you're trying to do 2 opposing motions at the same time. The second form of upper body stiffness that's costing you kilos is in the upper back and in the arms. When we think about the sumo deadlift, we think about it as the lift that leverages can be the make or break for your success. The typical deadlift hero is the guy who has crazy long arms and looks like he barely has to go down to the barbell. So if we're trying to maximize our own mechanical advantage, one of the key elements to this is thinking, how can I make my arms effectively as long as possible? Now, a very common thing you're gonna be taught with the deadlift is creating this upper back or lat tightness, because that's going to preserve your starting position. Now, while I'm not advocating for rounding or crunching over of the upper back, we have to remember a couple things here. Is that our rib cage and our spine have this natural sort of flush curvature in the mid and upper back, where if I have a rib cage that is back in space, obviously while not being crunched over, but is retracted, that is actually going to be the most stable position for it to be in. So driving a ton of extension in the upper back is actually an unnatural and not strong position to pull from. But more than that is that if I think about the shoulder blades and the role that they play with the arms, is that if I'm pulling my shoulder blades together, I am effectively shortening my arms, Whereas if I push my shoulder blades away from each other, I'm giving myself more arm length. So when I'm approaching the barbell, what I want to think about is creating the longest arms that I possibly can and releasing those shoulder blades away from the middle of the back. And you're gonna find that when you do this, it's a lot easier to create tension through the arms. It's a lot easier to get down to the bar because you've essentially maximized the length of the arms that you have available to you. Now, I also mentioned stiffness in the arms themselves because this is a huge part of this as well, which is that if we are creating too much tension in the arms, what's going to end up happening is the deformation or the technical breakdown will find its way down the chain. Now, what do I mean by this? If I have 600 pounds on the ground and it wants to stay on the ground, it's going to fight against me every chance it gets while I am deadlifting. And if I think about when I give the barbell resistance, what happens is that if I resist the barbell from my arms, the bar is going to find somewhere else down the chain to try to break down its technique. So a lot of times when I'm too stiff in the upper body and I'm resisting the bar just says, well, I'm just gonna deform your low back, or I'm going to make your knees cave in, right? I'm going to fight against some structure to prevent the bar from leaving the ground. However, if I let my arms be the thing that yields to the bar, meaning that as the bar is breaking the ground, I'm letting the bar pull my arms long, I'm letting it pull my shoulders away from my ears, then now I have something that is willing to deform to the barbell. And the reason that this is advantageous is that letting my arms yield to the barbell actually improves my leverage and starting position, whereas letting any other part of my body deform to the bar reduces my mechanical advantage and makes my starting position worse. So as I'm pulling and letting my arms get lengthened, I'm actually able to pull myself into a more upright position. I'm able to push through my quads harder and longer before breaking the floor, and you'll find, wow, I actually feel like I can generate as much force as I possibly can. The fourth reason that your deadlift sucks, and this goes along with point 3, is that you are actually bracing too hard. Now, we think of bracing as a safety precaution, as a way to produce more force, and in many ways this is true. But once you get past your initial early intermediate phase of powerlifting, you've probably learned how to brace sufficiently purely off of reflex, meaning that as you try to produce force, your body will naturally tense up sufficiently, at least for the deadlift. Now, the thing that differentiates the deadlift from the squat is that you do not have axial load being placed on your body when it comes to a deadlift compared to a squat. And what this means is that creating that trunk stiffness and completely reducing degrees of freedom is less of an imperative on a deadlift than it is a squat. Let's think about it this way. We have a trade-off whenever we brace, is that if we want stiffness and stability, we are going to sacrifice mobility and positioning. And a lot of times if we are over bracing on a deadlift, meaning that we're really taking in a ton of air and we're clamping down, creating that trunk stiffness actually reduces our ability to move into a hinge, it reduces our ability to open up our hips, it reduces our ability to shift forward on our center of mass back and forth. And why is this? Well, think about a squat. We brace as we descend because what we're trying to do is navigate this very specific range of motion without deviation. Whereas with the sumo deadlift, when we're setting up, we actually have a lot of movement going on and we have a lot of positions that we're trying to access. Another thing to keep in mind about bracing too hard is that if we take in too much anterior air and create too much anterior space and volume, we're actually working against a hinge, right? Think about a lot of the big guys, a lot of the super heavies. They all squat better than they deadlift. A big part of this is that they have a lot of anterior mass that is advantageous for a squat, but not necessarily advantageous for a deadlift. Whereas when you look at a lot of deadlifters, aside from the arm length, they look like they're just more slender individuals. This is not just incidental. So if you're taking in too much air, you might be bringing your center of mass forward and creating too much bulk around the waist that makes it a little bit harder to move into your starting position. If you're looking for more explanation on this, I would check out Nick Manders' video on the no brace method. Now, I'm obviously not advocating that everybody just doesn't brace at all, but a simple shallow breath of air, pressure breath, inhale, and kind of a reflexive brace as you start the pull is going to be much better for starting the deadlift than taking in the big hyperventilating Valsalva type of brace. The fifth and final reason that your sumo deadlift sucks is that you are not wedging properly, specifically that you are not shifting your center of mass forward. Now, I've used the term wedge, you've probably heard the term wedge. Let's actually define it. If we think about a lot of really good sumo deadlifters, we notice that there's this sort of pendulum swing that happens where the torso rotates more upright in conjunction with the pelvis and the hips moving closer to the bar, right? They complement each other. And that movement, that pendulum swing, is facilitated by a center of mass that starts over the heels and shifts to the forefoot. So we talked about the hinge and why it's so important for the deadlift a bit earlier. The reason is that a hinge brings your center of mass back and creates the space between you and the barbell to then rotate into. Right? If you don't have that space, you can't possibly rotate, right? I'm sure many of you guys have had the experience of trying to open the hips up and immediately your knees bang into the bar and you're like, well, I had no room. How am I supposed to open up my hips? How am I supposed to get into my quads? The hinge and the heel center of mass shift is what gives you that room. Now, as you're trying to pull the torso upright, to get that pendulum swing to happen, I need to shift my center of mass forward on my feet. So it's more than just a foot pressure, but actually this rocking forward into the forefoot and creating this strong pronation and compression into the ground through the quads. And you'll notice this amongst most high-level sumo deadlifters, which is that they have a very aggressive pronation, flattening of the foot into the ground. Sometimes based on the shape of their shoe, it'll almost look like their heel is coming up. That's not what's happening. It's really just that they are getting so much compression through the middle of the foot that the lip or the cup on the heel of the shoe sort of picks up in response to that. So in order to really maximize our ability to use our quads and keep our shoulders over the bar, we need to think about our bases of support, right? It wouldn't make sense to say, I want to have my torso and head over the bar here, and I want to have my quads over the bar here where I'm able to drive through, but then that my center of mass would be back here, right? I need all of my supports lined up, where my base of support is directly under the 2 points I'm looking to keep over the barbell. So if I want my head over the bar and I want my knees to stay forward pushing through the quads, guess what? I need my center of mass directly underneath it, which means I need more of that forefoot pressure. And as we talked about in my previous video, which if you haven't watched, go check out, packed full of information, we talked about the necessity of pronation for force production. So do not try to be rolling over the outsides of your feet and just staying stuck in supination, trying to spread the floor as you start the pull. It is a push, ironically, and not just a yank. So in order to push effectively, we need to be able to compress into the ground well, which means we need to be able to pronate well. So that's all I have for you guys in today's video. I appreciate all of you watching. If you found this helpful, please give it a like, share, subscribe, comment if there's anything you want to hear me talk about in the future. And if you are looking for a step-by-step technical masterclass on the sumo deadlift, head on over to Powerlifting Now, where I've made the How to Sumo Deadlift tutorial. Powerlifting Now is our subscription-based educational platform where for only $15 a month, you will have access to hundreds of long-form educational videos to level up your powerlifting game. As always, my name is Sean Noriega. I appreciate all of you, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.